Okay, I think we'll go ahead and begin the second panel. So welcome back. And the next panel is going to be moderated by Hatim el-Hibri, who's Assistant Professor of Film and Media Studies at George Mason University. His research and teaching interests focus on global and transnational media, visual culture, Lebanon and the Middle East, urban space and media technology. And his book is coming out very, very soon, called Visions of Beirut, The Urban Life of Media Infrastructures. We're really excited for that to be published. So welcome, Hatim, and I'll let you go ahead and introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Mona. I'm very excited to be here today with all of you, at least in this forum. I'm going to say a little bit about this panel and the links that I'm seeing already between the first panel and the other three that we have coming up. You know, some of the big questions animating these different papers are, as I'm seeing them, are what are the conditions of possibility of media? What gives media the form, shape, and structure that it has, that it takes? And how does thinking these questions through or from the Middle East yield theoretical insights that undo the matter of regionality, even as people in the region leave us undone? The link that I'm seeing between panel 1 and panel 2 revolves around the cutting edge of authority, right? How does the operation of media industries take shape, and what are their relationship to other commercial sectors, political actors, and institutional agendas? That will be one through line which I think carries through in the papers coming up in panel 2. But also in panel 2, the question also becomes about the shape and limits of the state, or the non-state facilitation of its formation. But also we start to delve into some of those questions of the micro practices and transactions that are involved in the enactment of organizational relationalities. I'd also just like to say that I think that there's maybe a running trend which we're all yearning towards, or that I'd like to try to encourage at the outset, which is for all of us to try to draw connections between the different papers here around the entanglement of aesthetics, affect, and media technology with questions of policy institutions and also, state ideology. So I'm going to introduce our panelists very briefly, and then I'm going to say a little bit about each of their papers and pose some questions to the three panelists. And then I'm just going to leave it open to either you can respond directly to my questions, or you can respond to each other's papers. So Nihat Celik is a lecturer in the School of Public Affairs at San Diego State University. Kay Dickinson is a professor of film studies at Concordia University. And Ziad Fahmy is a professor of modern Middle East history at Cornell University's Department of Near Eastern Studies. So each of these people have wonderful works which they've published either recently or are forthcoming. I encourage you to look up their books. I'll mention just the most recent books by Ziad, Street Sounds, and Kay Dickinson's Arab Film and Video Manifestos edited volume. Nihat also has work which circulates quite widely. Kay's paper asks us to think about supply chain capitalism as an organizing mode of extracting value from the differentials of policy, labor markets, and infrastructural conditions. Our paper centers on the UAE, but encourages us to think about the relationalities between regions and countries and industrial formations. The UAE is one particular location which offers sort of an advantageous form of facilitation. Iwa Ong comes up, and some of Iwa Ong's ideas come up here. I'm not going to summarize the papers in great depth, but I'm going to try to draw out some themes which I see are quite important. The the question of offshoring and runaway film production is one which vexes scholars sometimes. How do we actually get at those transactions? How do we get at how they operate, particularly insofar as they can end up either overstated in terms of how they're advertised, but also what are those social worlds, those worlds of labor? So I have like 4 interrelated questions for Kay about this question of supply chain labor, liberal arts education, and multiculturalism. Which is, the first one has to do with the question of racialization in this particular context, right? There's a way that the promise of the liberal arts education serves as almost not, I don't want to use the term civilizing or modernizing, but it certainly offers kind of an aspirational modernity or an aspirational cosmopolitanism. And presumably the measuring stick or the yardstick here is sort of a Western liberal democratic model to produce workers who can do work required of those industries. So how does that, you hint at this in the paper, but how does racialization play out in these spaces that you're analyzing? Relatedly, how does that either connect to or differentiate itself from like the aspirational form of the tech industry, which is sort of maybe takes one form in China, a different one in India. Dubai makes a certain bid for this. So if we're talking about film and the film industry or media industries, how does that line up with tech, or is it, or do you see them maybe increasingly dovetailing? I'd also relatedly love to know how, this isn't maybe the subject of the paper, but I'm interested in how things like film festivals, either in the UAE or in the region, play out here. Nihat gives us a look into some of these moments of transformation around the regulation, ownership, and operation of Turkish media. This is sort of like I love when we get sort of like, here's sort of like this decisive moment. When there's this liberalization of the press, it yields these new formulations, these new actors are able to make certain kinds of plays to either consolidate ownership or start a new media venture of their own. So you give us a turning point in the 1970s, which deepens in the 1980s, culminating in the consolidated ownership of the press in the 1990s. Part of this is, you also show us, is about privately owned broadcasting and the proliferation of satellite channels, making it so that you have a new business elite who can get into the game of media. You also give us, though, the emergence of the AK party and the economic / crisis of inflation, which they sort of use to fire back against what they see as the betrayers of the nation. So when we have the emergence of these media moguls, I get how they're, in part, this is like people closely aligned with the AK who are just either taking over existing enterprises or starting their own. I'm wondering if you can tell us, though, a bit more about what happens with state media in the wake of the 1990s. Part of the story that you tell us is tracing these transformations in a private sector, or the private sector's relationship to the Erdogan regime. But I was wondering if you could tell us, how the state media also transforms in this moment. And like, on that note, to what extent is this playing field regional and transnational? Right? How does, for example, a concern with Syria after 2011 enter into this? And this is maybe one of the points where there's, I think, maybe a great room of there's a great deal of room for dialogue between your paper, obviously Bill Gaze, who will be coming next week, but also with Adib, this turning point in neoliberal authoritarian intensification. 2011 seems to be a moment where there's not just shared learning between regimes, but also a regional playing field on which it's playing out. Ziad, it's so refreshing always to read your work. You take us into the world of radio broadcasting in this specific moment in Egyptian history. We have so little work that's done, media historical work on the history of broadcasting. And this is, you take us into the cafes, the rooms in the back shop of the electronics sales store, the appliance sales store. Before people thought that radio could be something that would be respectably run, right? It's like you show us how for a number of these operators in Egypt, as it was in other places at other times, like the primary purpose of running a radio station might not be to make money from it, but to encourage people to buy radios, buy radio sets. You also show us how with people like Radio Zabo, there's a way that the emergence of cheaper and more convenient to operate radio sets is part of this history. This seemed to me like this moment where the media history of radio, which in part is driven by specific radio set manufacturers, is potentially is impacting Egypt. But you also show us a radio public, not just noise regulations for cafes with blaring radios, which are played late into the night to pay off loans to buy the radio sets. But you also show us how attitudes towards radio animate this cultural moment, right? You have the specter of anarchy on the airwaves, which is marshaled as a threat to national character, which in the US, this gets resolved as syndicated corporatization as being in the national interest. In Egypt, it's the commercial itself, which is thought to be déclassé, vulgar, inappropriate, or even worse, fostering national rebellion, right? One sort of leading to the other. So the questions that I have here, though, are if we have this vulgarity of radio voices, to what extent was the appropriateness of the advertising pitch itself part of that? Not simply that the things being advertised, the working class dishes, the aphrodisiac internal organs which are being sold at discount, but also just sort of the idea of a radio listening public, which itself is marked by commercial interests. To what extent is that itself something you could play out for us? Also, so you point to us, and I know this is work which is still in early development, you point us to the importing of US manufactured radio sets. Was there import of radio sets from elsewhere, maybe in Europe? I'm thinking of Italian and British manufacturing in particular. And then again, maybe this is takes us beyond the scope of what you've been able to unearth so far. But what was there offshore or cross-border broadcasting, which is part of the story as well? People listening in, not just to say British radio in Mandate Palestine, but also like offshore, like in Cyprus. Were there other competing imperial radio regimes which played out? This is too early for Radio Berlin to be an ongoing concern, but so those are my sort of opening questions for all of you. And please feel free to either address my question or to speak to your other fellow panelists as well.
Are we doing this in order that you delivered the?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So I had longer to think, although I was hard to think of answers to these complex questions when you were just delivering so many other great ones to my fellow panelists. Thank you so much, Hatim. It's a pleasure to meet you, and ditto all the thanks that were previously given. Okay, so racialization. I obviously, yes, it's the UAE. It's a workforce. I mean, really, I'm interested less so in No, I'm interested in looking at the whole picture, although it didn't necessarily come out in this paper. So, I mean, you think about one of the great appeals of filming, of foreign production filming in the UAE is like how quickly sets can be built. So that all that labor, how quickly equipment can be moved in and out, all that kind of you know, kind of physical labor that's involved in filmmaking that we don't see necessarily even on credits is entirely racialized, as it is in most parts of the world, but particularly in the UAE. So absolutely, yeah, your question's completely on the nose. I would say that the kind of strata of educated media workers that I was particularly concerned with in this paper are a lot of the role they play is, I mean, when I talk to them, a lot of them talk about being translators, and they don't mean that. They mean that to a certain extent linguistically, but they're really talking about between a presumed kind of, maybe I'm working with Hollywood, so a Hollywood model and whatever's local, and working between those two. Or fixers, we might want to think. So we know all the politics of what it means to translate or be a fixer. I mean, all of that plays in and is racialized. And I don't even, I'm sure I don't even need to sort of give you examples of how it might work in terms of prejudicial encounters. I think what I'm really interested in alongside that is also just how expensive that education is. It's not just it's high school, it's elementary school, it's going to all those, you know, I'm sure it's an education many people who are listening right now have had, of being in an English medium elementary school, an international school. And it's repeatedly my kind of interlocutors have been saying, yeah, like I got the job because I knew about this cartoon that was on TV in the 90s. And we, you know, like stuff that you may not have, that comes through our school culture and then carries on up through university and so forth, that these are people that can get along with very quickly a particular kind of cadre of mobile filmmakers who are coming in as the first unit, as the sort of heads of department. And film crews are always like that, right? They have to assemble very quickly and then they disperse again. So the glue that's is being produced there is not just technical skills. It's knowing where to go for a drink and even drinking. It's all of this sort of thing, and I think that's really, you know, one of the things, and again, hugely racialized. All of those sort of textures of how one inhabits the world and what one's references are. I think it's also racialized at the level of it's about especially the university liberal arts model that you're talking about. I mean, I don't know how and why people sign up for it. I haven't actually asked people about like modernity and any of those questions. That's not really where I'm going. I'm interested in what that does to create a workforce who are flexible, believe in individual creativity, and how that frames a laborer's subjectivity. So the willingness to work, to contract, to be precarious ultimately, which is so anathema to how a Khaliji citizen thinks about what a job is. So that, I think that's probably the most forceful creation there is this sense of somebody who thinks for themselves and who, you know, is happy to sort of live on the edge of certain kind of securities that life provides, but because they're foregoing them for creativity and their passion for the media. And I think that idea runs very much counter to any sorts of a whole host of local educational traditions, right? From what we get from a Arab socialist state to what we get from Islam. That's kind of what I'm interested in. Where it gets racialized, I think we can probably fill in many of those gaps ourselves. Moving on, tech industry, I'm going to pass on that one. I think that's really fascinating, but I haven't done the research, so I'm not going to bullshit everyone there. Film festivals, I can do though, I think. So I did a certain amount of research on the Dubai International Film Festival, which is now defunct. And I ended up interviewing a fair amount of, they gave me very nice access. Everyone was very happy to speak. And even to me, you know, knowing that I was an outsider writing about it, I got a very heavy sort of like Yeah, but we all know this is the bait. This is to get people understanding this as a cultural, as a country where you could possibly have a cultural life, and that's we're working in a propagandistic fashion here. But at the same time, it like real hope in the region for at least a decade of filmmakers, like Palestinian filmmakers, Syrian filmmakers, everyone going, oh wow, we don't have to go to Europe for money now. We can negotiate through through people who understand the Arab region, and a different set of films was arguably made through that, which everyone was. Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting alternative. Where I want to end though on that is that the high up people who I spoke to were again really like quite open with me that this was to drive the real estate, that create, and I mean that in I mean that in the sense of like that you would want to come and work in this country, because now it's not that stereotype of the UAE anymore, where there's nothing to do for a cultured person, all in heavy scare quotes. But more importantly for them, that it would drive the real estate of an industry, a set of industries where not just the big media corporations would come in and headquarter there, which they have done since then, but also that smaller operations, smaller teams would be renting kind of freelance spaces. So there were no bones made about the fact that this was about real estate in the free zones. So it's kind of interesting that now that's really taken off. DIF, the Dubai International Film Festival, is no longer running. Make what you will of that. Yeah, so I guess that's me. Thanks.
It's a great series of contradictions.
It's in my own thinking or in the UAE?
No, that you've explained.
May I start, Hatim?
Please.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Media is highly related to politics, and politics has always been in politicians also have been involved in media because there was only government-owned media until the 1990s, and with the liberalization in the 1980s and the emergence of a larger industrial class in the 1990s, we start to witness the emergence of private media outlets. But before that, it was only state-owned media outlets, radio channels and television channels, TRT, the Turkish Radio Television, which is a government institution. But one striking thing is that I was a child in the 1990s, so I was able to compare the programs both in state-owned outlets and private outlets to what it is today. And it is very surprising for younger generations who did not have the chance to live through the 1990s, because starting with the 70s, there were coalition governments, multi-party coalition governments, and the left was able to find its place in the government, sometimes, as in the case of Bülent Ecevit, as the majority party who led the coalition with other actors. And the government television, state-owned television, TRT, was highly liberal. Opposition members were able to express their voices, and another interesting thing was that there were debates before the elections. Political party leaders were invited to a special program for elections, and they were able to discuss it. But today it's impossible. Another thing is maybe a bit symbolic, but to show you the extent of top-down imposition of the conservative worldviews of the current AK Party or Justice and Development Party government. On the New Year's Eve, people generally prefer to watch the old recordings from the 70s, 80s, and 90s from the state-owned television channels, because the concept, everything was different. You can also observe it in the attire, outfit of female singers or actresses, even to maybe a bit symbolic, but belly dancers. For example, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, in these New Year's Eve special programs, you could see them, but now not anymore. That's out of the question. And when we come to 1990s, with the emergence of the private media outlets, television channels, and radio channels, Muppet shows about politicians or cartoons on the papers, on the printed media, the younger people say, wow, they had programs, shows like Muppet shows about politicians, criticized them, made fun of them, but nothing happened to them. Yes, of course, there were still, pressures on media members, but the picture started to change with after 2002, but especially as Hatim pointed out, and I think this may create some connection with Ziad's paper, especially after 2011. Because the Justice and Development Party government saw the Arab Spring as a ripe moment for increasing Turkey's influence in the Middle East. And also it coincided with other processes. It was able to consolidate its power internally through bringing its favorites to key positions in the government and bureaucracy. And after its rule over the years, it was able to reward the business circles that supported its rule. So the business people, for example, were whose media outlets did not criticize the government. Even news outlets like NTV, for example, their owners, they had business interests. They were able to renew their government contracts. Or if they had, business in mining industry, they were able to renew their license. So they didn't face any obstacles. And this also led to private sector refraining from publishing their editorials on private outlets which were critical of the government. And these financial restraints in the long term really diminished their capacity for survival. But with 2011, with the Arab Spring, the JDP did not require the EU support anymore, thanks to its internal consolidation of power. And it started to impose a new worldview. Actually, what we had said before, when they said we are conservative Democrats, the EU membership is our top priority. People said, like me, we were, suspicious about their secret agenda and transforming the state, destroying its secular character. After 2011, we start to witness that with the regime becoming more authoritarian and emphasizing Turkey's role in the Middle East as the successor of the Ottoman Empire. So rather than Turkishness, which is highly debated, Islam started to become the key force. And again, maybe with Ziad's paper connection, for example, you can also see the changes in foreign policy in media. These days, Turkey is trying to renew its relations with the Sisi regime in Egypt. And, after the Sisi's coming to power through the coup, the AKP government used to call him dictator and was welcoming the Egyptian opposition members. The thing is that for them, it was with Arab Spring, with the Ikhwan al-Muslimin or Muslim Brotherhood coming to power, there would emerge in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, or in Lebanon, or in other, or like the El-Nahda movement, starting from North Africa, stretching to the east, there would be Muslim Brotherhood governments, which would be friendly to the Justice and Development Party. But that policy unfortunately backfired. And as the regime, as the Erdogan's regime now trying to revive the relations between Turkey and Egypt, they instructed the Egyptian media outlets in Turkey, which were probably sponsored by the government, not to criticize the Sisi regime anymore. So people follow these news outlets and their TV channels. Rather than anti-Sisi propaganda, they are now broadcasting programs about religion or other things out of politics. So they are staying to trying to avoid any problem areas. So Muslim Brotherhood ideology and inform policy and its reflection in domestic politics, transforming the society to make it more conservative with a top-down approach, found its reflections in the government's approach to media. So that explains why there is huge pressure today over the media with financial resources, or, over the financial resources, or court-related issues for journalists or cartoonists. So that explains the level of government's power over the media. And maybe again, with the changes in the Middle East, for example, Turkish soap operas were very popular in the Middle East in about 10 years ago. However, later, due to the rift with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, over Egypt, over Syria, and over the Muslim Brotherhood ideology in general, many of these countries prohibited broadcasting of Turkish soap operas, arguing that they are destroying the cultural values of their respective countries. Again, the relationship between foreign policy and media is very, very clear. And the same happens in Turkey. For example, some TV series which are broadcasted through Netflix are prohibited with the claim that since the government has control over the Radio and Television Supervisory Board, they are violating the family values and cultural values of the Turkish society, so they are censored. To sum up, and I can answer more questions in the Q&A section from our dear participants, it is highly related, but I can say that with the resistance of the public to the changing authoritarian atmosphere, despite their problems, opposition outlets, especially secular outlets, are still able to survive, and they owe it to the public support behind them, because otherwise they don't get any funds from private sector, very limited amounts. But the people, they pay money to buy the paper or donate money to some TV channels in order to allow them to survive. So that's how they survive, actually, with the public support. Thank you.
I love a good story about conservative forces seizing the means of media production so as to prevent further corruption of the public.
And that's probably a good transition, I suppose, to my paper somewhat, because that's precisely what began to take place in Egypt in 1934 with shutting down of many of the private Egyptian stations. I want to preface my response beforehand, since it seems like I'm doing ancient history compared to most of the panelists. So I'm really a historian of the modern Middle East that dabbles into media. So I'm learning a lot from all of you. I guess I'll start in order with some of the questions and comments that you made, Hatim, and thanks so much for reading the paper. The first comment that you made, question that you made, was concerning how radio was in a way viewed as a threat by the Egyptian government, especially in that earlier, I would call it the Wild West period, from 28 to 34, until, of course, it was monopolized by the Egyptian state. It wasn't just the Egyptian government, to preface it was both. This is one of the occasions where both the British government and the Egyptian government found common cause. In a way that radio was essentially the new media of the time, and for many reasons was certainly viewed as a threat, simply because it has the potential to reach so many people. And in this case, of course, within the Egyptian context, also because it could reach illiterate audiences and beyond. So for both the Egyptian government, the Egyptian palace, and the British, they were very much worried about Egyptian nationalists and others, and also enemies on the outside as well. They were always wary of the potential of Italian interference through some of their own broadcasting, Libari radio later on and beyond. Also somewhat connected in a way to Kay's paper, in her discussion of what she calls the migrant media workers. In many ways, some of these early Egyptian pioneers were, in effect, migrant media workers as well. I mean, many were Egyptian, but others were Syro-Lebanese. Sabo, of course, was sort of an Egyptianized Hungarian. And we have one of the operators of one of the early stations in Egypt was called Radio Sheridan. And he was sort of an American wannabe mogul that was operating this station in Egypt for that short period of time. So for all of those reasons, radio was viewed as obviously a tool and a great potential tool for civilizing, but at the same time, when it's in the wrong hands, it has a great deal of potential for danger. And this is one of the primary reasons why eventually it was decided to shut down all these private stations in May of *34 and start the official sort of Egyptian radio station, which was in effect also a multinational operation for the first decade of its operation, 13 years or so until '47. It was 49% owned by Marconi Limited. And so it was, so the British were still certainly involved. 51% of the shares were owned by the Egyptian government. Moving on to your next question on vulgarity, and especially vis-a-vis the commercials that were broadcast on Egyptian radio before '34. In a way, this was a sort of a false narrative that was sort of, I think, created by the Egyptian government as a way to legitimize and justify its move of monopolizing the airwaves. So some of these examples that I talked about in the paper were actually, they were not real examples. They were sort of manufactured by the Egyptian state in order to exaggerate the types of commercials that were being played on the airwaves. And you're right in suggesting that that fear of vulgarity, regardless of whether it's exaggerated or not, is certainly connected to the reach of radio. It's not just what the content was, but the fact that ordinary people can listen to it in hundreds of thousands and beyond, especially as radio sets continue to get cheaper well into the 50s and 60s and beyond. But it's something that is often used by many, not just within the Egyptian government, by the Egyptian elites as well, sort of for fear of having this new tool in the hands of people who might abuse it in a way. And so that's, and it was definitely something that was a good excuse that the Egyptian government used to legitimize why, because it was very controversial, that move from privatizing and shutting down all these private stations to having just one state-owned radio. As far as the media landscape in Egypt at the time, it was kind of a mixed landscape. So in a way, it's different than some of the changes that happened in Turkey, as Nihat talks about, in that only really radio broadcasting post '34 was state-owned, and you still have most of the press was private. The film industry was predominantly private. The recording industry as well was private. And it wasn't really until the Nasser years when all of those various types of media were brought into the fold in a similar model as Egyptian broadcasting, which sort of makes it an interesting period to study, because it was certainly a period of transition. But also that radio model of state-owned radio is not, again, it's not about Middle Eastern exceptionalism or any of that. This is very much an international model. And so BBC was pretty much was the model that was used as far as Egyptian radio was concerned. Your third point about transnational listening, absolutely. But there's a caveat there. You had to afford to have a shortwave radio, which tended to be a little bit more expensive at the time than a medium wavelength radio sets. But there's plenty of evidence that not just Egyptians were listening to radio from outside of Egypt, but Egyptian radio was being listened to beyond Egyptian borders as well. And even some of those private earlier stations that I talk about in this particular paper. So just opening up even el-Ahram newspaper throughout this period and beyond, you would have a listing of many of the European stations and what was being played. Also, as you mentioned, the Palestine Broadcasting station as well. They would have some of what the programming was, and it was listed in many of those newspapers. So it was very much sort of a transborder type of affair. The state attempted to interfere and tried to, and was always wary, both the British and Egyptians, because of Arabic broadcasting from Bari radio, as I alluded to before, and later on Berlin radio, of course, and beyond as you move into the 1940s. Radio manufacturing, yeah, I just, the example that I talked about was about American radios because it was a popular model, that I discussed. But of course, you have radio manufacturing coming in from France and Germany and elsewhere. But also, more interestingly, sometimes even cheaper radios were put together in some of these shops from different parts. And so there's plenty of examples that I can find in the Egyptian press of people sort of dabbling and putting together their own radio sets, which were much cheaper as well. So I think I'll pause there, and hopefully we'll have some great questions.
I'm tempted to monopolize the conversation because the three of you have such rich work here, but I wanted to give an opportunity to everyone else to chime in. I'm keeping my eye on the Q&A panel. I guess just a quick follow-up for Ziad, since it's at top of mind. I'm noticing that there's kind of a gender dynamic to radio here as well. These radio announcers were all men, I'm guessing. It sounds like.
Okay. No. And I say maybe in this paper, maybe the examples that I showed because of the sources, nature of the sources, but there were some radio programming even in that early period from 28 to 34, but certainly after with Egyptian radio post 34, there were some programs for home economics, for example. Children's programming were predominantly it was women that were presenters. Probably, I would say the majority of the music that was being played was sung by female artists. Not only that, there's in the chapter that I'm writing, this is going to be a part of a book that I'm writing on Egyptian history. But Quran reciters or female Quran reciters on the radio, and so until they were essentially banned. But so. Yeah, so women were very much a part of radio from early on.
That's very striking to hear, very interesting to hear. Female Quranic recitation on Egyptian radio back in the day.
There was.
Keeping my eye on chat. We have a question from an attendee. Question for Kay. In the credits for European films and TV series, I frequently notice acknowledgement of specific tax haven authorities and their role in producing these works. Is there a similar dynamic in regional film and TV? What is the origin of this phenomenon, and why is it so prevalent?
I mean, it's prevalent because, the whole world's competing to bring in these productions. Major sites, globally would be Vancouver in Canada, and London is massive too. And and each has their own advantages. Vancouver is the same time zone as Hollywood. It has the same language. It's easy to get there. London has a very established, but also not so strongly unionized production, set up. But each of these sites, and the UAE in particular now, are offering massive rebates to bring in production. And obviously it's tax-free already in Dubai, but Abu Dhabi offers, I think, a 30% rebate on all production spend. And it's a kind of race to the bottom, really. It's like selling off kind of, and I mean, and also what's kind of, so yes, that's about bringing in production spend, but it's also, it saves costs in other ways. So in a lot of the countries where Hollywood goes, let's take Britain. I know we're not talking about, we're meant to be in the Middle East, but that's a country with healthcare provision. So it means you don't have to pay like health insurance for the workers. There's all sorts of added benefits to that initial drawing in. So yeah, it's a big deal, and I think part of at one point Abu Dhabi had the most sort of generous tax tax rebates for any productions that came in. Is there a similar dynamic in regional film and television? If it's non-national and it can prove itself in that way, then yes. But there's it's also part of a real move to create free zones, and sort of these exceptional sites of production where not only is do you have new rules about who can rent property, who can base themselves there, that override, let's say, Emirati sort of legislation proper, but it's also I've lost my train of thought now. Yeah, so sorry, let me too many things going on at once. So it's also the free zone has exceptional kind of freedom of speech legislation in place. It has, and that same thing goes for the university sector, which are also in free zone. So it's this constant sort of creation of archipelagos of exception within countries like with Emirates like Dubai, where like you can do all sorts of things which are completely sort of locked into a much more sort of globalized free trade kind of economy, and yet keep a citizenry within a particular other legal framework. And that you could be commuting in and out of these on a daily basis, but each of them allows for the flows of capital or conversely different forms of kind of state control within a very small space of within a very small geographical space. So yeah, that's probably all I would answer on that for the moment.
I have a question for Ziad from Heather Jabir. Hi, Heather. Ziad, I'm thinking about your presentation in conversation with Amar's provocation about temporality. Looking at pre-1934 radio through the lens of temporality, what other kinds of formations or discourses were emerging and perhaps stunted or transformed through state takeover of radio that seem like they could have gone another way? And further, thinking of work which is trying to excavate other kinds of futures from the past, what does this mean about the anxieties or hopes for our intellectual work on the region today? Oh, you got
Of course, the mute button. That's the classic Zoom world problem there. Yeah, very good question. I think I'll respond to it in two ways. First, temporality when it comes to futurism in particular, and then the other one, I'll go back to Hatim's question in the first panel on simultaneity. But for the first part of it, absolutely there was, in addition to the fear of radio, and especially in the wrong hands as far as vulgarity or interference from elsewhere and so forth, there was always the great promise of radio as a new technology. And it very much was viewed as almost a panacea for all of life's problems. There was always dozens of articles on a regular basis on how it will educate the masses, uplift the peasants, improve agricultural yield through somehow, so educating the peasants on how to raise their crops, literally a lot of exposés on radios being used in the classroom. I mean, I guess sort of like Zoom. And you'd have these images and attempts by the state of putting radio sets in some classrooms with all the children sort of listening in and somehow taking notes and all of this. There was also educational programming for teaching people how to read and write that were said on the radio. But also there was an economic component as well, because there was a lot of great opportunity for people for repairing radio sets. So there's all kinds of different schools that will teach people how to repair the radio and learn about the technology. There were schools for radio announcing and teaching people how to announce and present on the radio. So it was, in a way, it was viewed as something that would sort of revolutionize Egyptian culture. And obviously this was similar elsewhere as well. It wasn't just in Egypt.
A question for Nihat from Daniel Turner. When you brought up soap operas, I immediately thought of Erdogan's attacks on the immensely popular Muhtasham Yüzyıl. You said that today many soap operas are being censored, but why was Muhtasham able to continue for a couple of years after Erdogan's attacks on it? Why wasn't it censored or prohibited?
Thank you, Daniel. First of all, at that time, the AKP government was not as authoritarian as it is today. The last part of the Muhteşem Yüzyıl, or the Magnificent Century, which depicted the era of the Ottoman Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent, ended in 2014. But still, some parts of the series, a historical TV drama, infuriated Erdogan, especially the costumes. And after his criticisms, the Radio and Television Supervisory Board started an investigation and issued a warning to that TV show. And the directors and producers of the TV show then adjusted the costumes of of actresses, especially Hürrem Sultan, who was the beloved wife of Süleyman the Magnificent. And they censored some of the more intimate scenes in order to, appease, in order to satisfy Erdogan's concerns. But still, it was very popular, especially among housewives, the general population. So even despite his criticisms about the TV series, Erdogan could not go further. He was a bit afraid of the reaction of the public in general. That was the reason. But not only in Turkey, it was broadcast in other countries. For example, in Malaysia as well, it created a debate about Islamic values because of some of the scenes and costumes worn by actresses. It caused problems in other countries. And as a reaction to the TV series, the AKP government encouraged a historical drama series on the state television channel TRT1, Diriliş Ertuğrul, which is about Osman Gazi's father who founded the Ottoman Empire, and it started to impose their own interpretation of the Ottoman history. And maybe again with a connection with foreign policy, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, Turkey was trying to emphasize the ties between itself and the Arab world. And there was another TV show, again on the state-owned television channel, TRT1, Kutül Amare. The Battle of Kut was fought in Iraq in 1916 against the British forces during the First World War, and it was an Ottoman victory in which the British commander, General Tausch, became a prisoner of war. So that TV show, that series that depicted the battle and the brotherhood between Turkish and Arab people was actually a message to the Middle East, to the Arab world, saying, look, we have fought against imperialism together in the past, so cooperate with us on issues like Palestine or in other areas. And it was again used for foreign policy purposes. But in general, many of the TV shows, soap operas, Turkish soap operas in the Middle East are criticized for destroying the Islamic values, as in the case of Malaysia. So in some countries now they are prohibited. Thank you.
question for Ziad from Yasmin Mul. Ziad, I was struck by how similar the moral panics over radio in the 1930s seemed to the moral panics over satellite media in the early 2000s in Egypt, when both statist and oppositional intellectuals decried the chaos it ostensibly engenders. Part of this chaos was the sense that Kul Man Hab wa Dab now has access to instruments of mass broadcast that ordinary people can now interact with impressionable masses through the screen. It seems that your early radio people valued precisely this audience interaction. How did this carry over into state radio?
A very good question, Yasmin. Yeah, the dynamic shifted dramatically. There was less of people being concerned about the vulgarity of radio, at least in the mainstream media, after the state took it over. You definitely had a lot of independent media voices in Egypt at the time, because a lot of the newspapers were private. And surprisingly, many were critical of state radio, but it wasn't for that element of vulgarity. It was actually the opposite, because very early on, from roughly speaking, from 34 to 37, the state was still trying to figure out what was the proper messaging and the proper language to be used within Arabic radio broadcasts. And often it was quite a bit elitist early on. So they went to the other extreme. And so most of the critiques were the fact that the gatekeepers, if you will, the cultural gatekeepers of the radio station were limiting a lot of Egyptian voices. And that was for the first couple of years, I would say from 34 to 36, that was predominantly what the critique was. Eventually, they sort of recalibrated their radio programming where it was more sort of mainstream, middle of the stream. But there wasn't necessarily all these attacks against the vulgarity of the state radio, because it was not, it was definitely quite conservative, relatively speaking, compared to the dozens of stations that were there beforehand. So.
Do any of our panelists have questions for each other?
There was actually another question from me in the Q&A that I haven't, yeah.
I'm seeing it now.
I also have a question for Ziad, but do you
Sure,
see the question?
If you can see the question in the Q&A.
Yeah, that's it's about media regulation, and then it says, does it come into tension with these new directions? So some of that I've answered, but it's I think, yeah, it's a question of free zones allow for different rules and allow for calibrated to trade, allowing for certain types of media to be made that maybe wouldn't be made in the state proper. And you see this, this tension playing out in all sorts of ways, and in the educational sector too. Lots of, you hear stories on the weekly basis almost of like not particularly culturally kind of acclimated, American prof comes into campus X and teaches Y and, makes a mess of it and riles up, kind of local sentiment and maybe worse. And it's the same in media. You've got, but if in some ways it's about how things kind of conform to particular sets of expectations that are treasured and guarded and local. So a movie like Sex and the City 2 is very famously couldn't film in Abu Dhabi because it was disrespectful. Films like Free Fall, the Mission Impossible movie, which probably most people don't even know was partially shot in Abu Dhabi, is going to have a lot more leeway, precisely because you don't know it's shot there. So I think what you don't know is the interesting territory here, because if you don't know it's shot there, it's also, you don't know what kind of labor conditions it's shot under. You don't know who's getting paid. You don't know, you don't know how the sets are being built. All of these things are the obfuscations of a big budget film. That question also had this new dimension in it, and I don't think this is new. I think this is the Gulf ports doing its very, very historically embedded thing that it does so well, which is negotiating and coordinating differentials of trade from different regions and inputs. And I do kind of get, I'm sure most of us do, kind of upset that the idea that this is new to the Gulf, that yes, maybe the creative economy in the way it's being formulated right now is something of a meteoric kind of development, but the way in which these negotiations are happening are very Hibri. That's why it's working in many senses, because these are free ports traditionally. These are places of meeting. These are places of hosting. These are places where the laws will fluctuate according to whoever's trying to do business. So I guess, yeah, that was my answer to that one. Sorry, I flagged my own question. I had a question for Ziad though, which I haven't really managed to formulate, but it is your mention of Nasser at the end, and maybe this sort of sense of maybe this is something Nasser is sort of holding on to at that particular, that he's getting. And I'm kind of, obviously Nasser's radio is incredibly transnational and incredibly threatening at the transnational level. So I kind of was wondering, what was happening at that level of political propaganda beyond, what were the British? Did the British have any stakes in broadcasting? Along those lines, or not really?
Yeah, well, okay. So in this project, conveniently, I'm stopping at 52 for that book because I think Nasser deserves a whole new. I probably would have to have the entire book. I already have the title in mind, like Nasser's Radio, because the dynamics are quite different. Also because eventually, once he consolidates power later on, he would nationalize media in all media in 1960 with a similar model to how the Egyptian station itself was nationalized. I haven't delved into this because this is going to be a whole new project potentially. But the dynamics were probably quite different as far as on the ground. Going back to my period when it comes to the British, of course there was, in part it was reactionary because of the Italian Bari radio, which was broadcasting in Arabic in the mid 30s. Even before Berlin radio was also broadcasting in Arabic. So they saw sort of the writings in the wall and they quickly tried to transition to create BBC Arabic. And they would use a lot of elements and bringing in some broadcasters from the region somewhat. And they, in a way, they learned a lot from the way that the Italian Bari radio, how it was being used. But also they made sure they had a lot of media experts, local Egyptian and others from the Arab world, and they would use, they would listen in and figure out how the Egyptian radio was being performed and being used, and so there was a bit of a calibration there on what's the most effective ways of propaganda. So they were very much aware of all of those dynamics, but they weren't pioneers. I think they were reacting to the Italians. In this context, as far as the propaganda coming in from BBC Arabic, but yeah, they were very much fearful of the airwaves, and this is why they had to participate. So.
I have one other question for the panel, and it's a question about the middle class. To what extent are the middle class, either as an imaginary figure, an actually existing audience to be consolidated and advertised to, or a set of workers within an emerging labor pool with the correct levels of cultural capital to successfully function on a transnational field? To what extent is the middle class a figure in your research and in your objects of inquiry? Whoever wants to take it.
I'll just give it a quick shot. I mean, I haven't focused on, for this particular project, on middle class formation, and my book on soundscapes and street sounds that just came out, a big part of it was concerned the middle class and middle class formation. But on the fly, I would say that most of the radio announcers and operators were definitely from that within that middle class. Not necessarily, of course, the owners themselves per se. They had quite a bit of money. but it certainly had an effect on middle-class formation when it comes to consumerism, when it comes to buying, and in particular, early on and beyond, when radio was such a quite an expensive item. And so one way to sort of display your entry in this sort of upwardly mobile middle class was being able to afford this radio set, which was probably a half a month's salary. And that radio set would be displayed in a very probably prominent part of your home. Often when I look at the used book market and other antiques in Egypt, there's a lot of people selling older photographs from people's homes. And throughout the 1930s, probably the most common photograph was the entire family right in front of the radio. It's almost like, look what I have here. So in many ways, in connection with consumerism, that's something that's sort of getting into that a place where you can afford to have the radio, but also a lot of the programming. But again, this is early on in the project itself, was predominantly geared towards the middle class, from the program on home economics. There's the programming on sports. We're beginning to take shape as well, national sports and beyond. So it's very much intertwined, I think, with the history of radio.
I can jump in. Yeah, I'm really fascinated by. I'm not fascinated by middle class. I think we're horrible, but I'm interested in them in this country. Because in many ways, because the scholarship on labor tends to focus on manual blue collar labor, and rightly so. That's a very important political thing for us to be studying. And then the scholarship on the middle classes tends to be, especially when it's from South Asia or regarding South Asian populations, is very much on consumer citizenship. So the labor gets assigned, and the consumption gets assigned according to class. So yeah, I'm fascinated by what this middle class strata, middle class migrants are contributing to the Emirati economy, and I mean that also in terms of education. So these kind of, let's call them franchise universities that we find across the Gulf, the private ones, it's that's second or third generation of migrants who wish to remain in the country, who probably are looking to continue to work in the country afterwards, so that they are the consumers of this education, and they're the ones that are going into this kind of workforce. And of course, they're there because their parents are middle class, and their parents have had the kinds of visas that allow them to bring a family, which is not the same for the people working in construction or domestic labor, for example. So it's that sort of, and then in turn, the dream might well be to start a family yourself with those kinds of middle class jobs, so as to maintain your status as such in this country that you will never get citizenship rights to. So yeah, that's kind of my take on it, and like as a labor force, but also as consumers of education, and really shaping what education is looking like in the region right now. I mean, in the Gulf. Thanks.
I think I can drop in. Regarding the power of middle class, well, it is a bit difficult to present it as a monolithic social group, especially in Turkey. But I can say that the white-collar employees, the educated urban middle-class members, are more prone to oppose the Justice and Development Party, and all public opinion surveys show that. And as former Minister of Energy in 2014 said, the higher the level of education, the lower level our votes are in elections. So I can mention that some singers, some actors, actresses who are pro-government because of their interest, because they have programs on state-owned television channels, they are boycotted by the middle-class members, because people do not buy their DVDs, do not go to their concerts. That's the way, and they also want to support the people who opposed. But by the way, before I think we are approaching the end of our panel, I think am I able to share screen, Hatim? I just want to show a poster about the TV series Friends. It was found indecent, and the pro-government Islamist media outlet newspaper Akit actually blurred the poster. Okay, I can share it now. Blurred the poster where the arms of the actresses were seen, and the title it reads Netflix with its indecent TV series Friends aims to target the youth. So they are destroying the social structure, the traditional values of the nation, and it is very much in parallel to what's going on in Turkey recently this week. This is actually 10 days old, almost 10 days old. The withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention on violence against women and in general about the women's rights and LGBTI rights, a hot public debate is going on at the moment. And it is actually two polarized groups, two different worldviews, which are based on different values, are clashing, actually. That is the situation. And that's why the media is polarized, highly polarized. Thank you.
Yes, Friends is destroying the youth. This is I think we're just at the edge of our time. So I'm going to take the opportunity to thank our panelists as well as everyone who attended for making this such a wonderful conversation. It's been very stimulating, and looking forward to continuing the conversation tomorrow.